Hey guys, welcome to another painting class. I'll be your teacher, Corey J, and I'm really excited about today's piece. So today is all about painting peonies, and we're gonna paint my favorite peony, which is this one right here. Now, I've actually used this reference photo before for one of my pieces, and I just fell in love with it so much. And when I went to look for a reference photo for this video, I stumbled upon it again and thought, okay, I'm gonna use it again because I just love it so much. And the really good thing about this reference photo is just one peony that we're painting, but it has so many petals on it and it creates so many values. So there's super light values and there's super dark values and everything in between. So it makes it a really good piece to learn how to mix values. And that's just what we're gonna do today. Now, another part of this project that I really love is using a full color background. So in this case, we use red for the background today. But what happens is we paint the background first and then little bits of it shine through the painting as we paint on top of it. So it's one of my favorite techniques to use because I love those little magical bits of color that shine through, and I just think it's so beautiful. Now at the first part of the lesson today, I'm going to teach you how to use a monitor to trace your image over top. So you can use a laptop monitor, you can use a CPU monitor, or in my case, you'll see I've plugged my laptop into a TV. Now I just did this with an HDMI cable, so you'll have to make sure that you have an HDMI cable if you want to enlarge it, but it's a really good technique for kind of getting your drawing onto the canvas, and it's really seamless and easy. So we're going to start with that today. If you don't have an HDMI cable, you don't have to plug in your computer to your TV. You can just do it right on the screen of your computer and kind of scroll up and down to get the full image in. So without further ado, let's get into it. To start, you want to grab a piece of tracing paper or a see-through loose leaf, whatever you have, that's the same size as your painting surface. So today I'm painting on a 9 by 12 inch piece of canvas paper. And then you want to hold it up to whatever monitor that you're using and adjust the size of the picture on your computer so that it's closer to the size of your paper and the image fits into the paper. So for me, all I'm concerned about is the size of the flower for this piece. I don't really care about the background because I'm going to change that. And then you just want to grab a piece of painter's tape. I like using this painter's tape because it's easy to take off and doesn't damage the screen. And you want to center your piece or wherever you want to have it, and then tape the piece onto your monitor. Now you want to be light with the tape and light with your hands, just light with everything when you're touching the monitor. Obviously you don't want to damage the monitor. And then you want to go through and trace it. Now, just like I said, when you're using your pencil and you're tracing it, you want to make sure that you're light-handed with it so that you don't dent your monitor. And then if you find that there's some areas that are kind of hard to see, you can just up the brightness on your screen or your program. So here I'm using Photoshop, so it's really easy for me to make it a lot brighter. And that'll make it so it's easier to see through. And then you can get those last little details that you couldn't quite see if it's not bright enough. And it's important here to turn all of the shapes into a linear drawing. You don't want to add any values to this. You just want to create an outline to fill in with the paint. Next, you're going to go through and grab your piece of canvas paper and tape it down to your drawing board. I like to use painter's tape for this because it comes off really easy and it stays on nice and I don't have to worry about it being on for a couple days straight and not coming off. So you just go through and you put that down, and you just want to make sure that you layer the painter's tape on the edge of the paper with the same width all the way around, because this is going to create your border. And then just press it down so that none of the paint seeps under. Next, I'm going to go through with this acrylic glazing medium. This is a gloss. It doesn't matter if it's matte or gloss. You just want to get an acrylic medium. And if you don't have an acrylic medium, you can just use white paint and you're just going to go around the edges with this. And this just helps so that when you peel off the tape after, you have these nice, beautiful, crisp edges. And this step is totally optional. So if you want to skip this step, you can totally skip it. But I always find that it's really nice to be the last thing I do, peel off that paint and see those beautiful, crisp edges. It's just really, really satisfying. So once you have that on, you just want to let it dry. And then I'm going to start here with my background. So here I have three colors, the light pink, the purple, and the red. And I'm going to mix them all together to create a background with a bit of varying color. But you don't need to even do that. If you just want to go ahead and paint the background all red, or red with a little bit of white in it, maybe to make a nice pinky tone, you can go ahead and do that. I decided to vary the color because I wanted the little parts that peek through at the end to be varied in color, but you don't really notice it that much, to be honest. So you can just go ahead and paint the whole thing red. And this is a technique where you lay down a color that's really, really strong in the background. And then as you paint over it, little bits of it shine through in the most beautiful ways. And I'm just really, really, really into this technique, especially with my style where I use a lot of really strong colors. It's really awesome to see that effect. It's really kind of high contrast, and it just looks so nice seeing little bits of red peek through. Okay, so you want to let that dry completely, and then you're going to bring over your drawing and find where you want to place it, and then tape it down there at the top. Again, I'm using painter's tape. It's my favorite. And yeah, find your right position and then tape it down at the top. Now, I like to only tape it down at the top so that I can lift it up and see how it's going and if the drawing is transferring properly. Then I'm going to take this charcoal transfer paper and place it down here. And I like to use a different color than the one that I did the original drawing on. So I did the original drawing with pencil, so I'm going to grab this orange pencil crayon and go over the drawing here and make it transfer. And the reason why I use a different color is I can see what I've done. And I'll just take a peek to make sure that it's transferring properly, which I always suggest that everybody does. It'll let you know if you need to push harder or softer when you're retracing it. And I really think that tracing is a skill. It's not as easy as it looks. So definitely take your time with this and just go ahead and get those areas nice and proportionate. All right, and when you're done, you should have your peony transferred onto the background. Okay, so I'm going to paint this peony to be a blue peony. You can change the color if you'd like, but what you want to do is you want to get a dark blue, a medium blue, and a light blue, or whatever version of color that you're going with today. In addition, I also have white for the highlights that I'm going to do at the end, and I also have a little bit of pink. And that's because I want to add in some reflections of my background into the piece as I work. So to start off, I'm just going to mix some of this navy dark blue here. And I'm going to start by filling in all the petals that are the darkest around my piece. And the reason why I'm doing that is because it'll be a good frame of reference as I go and add different values to know, okay, compared to the darkest leaf, how dark do I want to make this, or how light do I want to make this petal? So I'm going to go and start with the darkest so I have that frame of reference for the entire piece. And I like to use a technique for the petals that's kind of a like mix as you go technique. So I'll lay down some paint, and before that paint has an opportunity to dry, I'll go in and grab another color and mix that in so that they can blend. So acrylics, a lot of people don't like acrylics and prefer oils because acrylics dry so fast. I love acrylics for the possibilities of all the layering that you can do. But because of that, they do dry really, really fast. So you want to kind of mix and blend as you go so that they don't dry as you're trying to lay the main color down. And for a piece like this where you're working in little areas, that's really, really easy to do because you just have to focus on one little area at a time. And you might think, oh, this painting has so many leaves or so many petals. This is going to take me a long time to do, but just take it one petal at a time. So you want to go and fill in the darker petals first. If you lay down some color and it doesn't lay down properly, just let it dry completely and then go over it. So these acrylic paints have a pretty high opacity, which is really awesome. And the higher the lighter the color gets, the better the opacity too. So you can always add in a bit of white to your color if it's not covering good enough, and it'll cover quite a bit better. Then I'm just going to go in here and do the details of this piece, the little part that's folded over here. And you'll see that I switched to a smaller brush for this part. So you always want to make sure that you're painting with the brush that's appropriate for the area that you're trying to fill in. So if you're filling in a smaller area, you want to make sure you have a smaller brush on hand. And if you're filling in a bigger area, you want to make sure you have a bigger brush. And that's so that you have to make less brush strokes, and also so that less brush strokes show up on your piece. So I'm just going to go through and finish up this petal here, and just by adding the highlights. And yeah, another thing that you want to make sure that you do is make brush strokes in the direction of the image that you're trying to portray. So for example, this petal has some details that follow certain lines, and you want to make the brush strokes follow those lines. So after you finish the main part of the petal and you let it dry, then I'm going to go through with this pink tone and I'm going to mix it a little bit into the blue just to tone it back a little bit so the color's not so strong. And then I'm just going to go through and add in a little bit of pink. And to me, this is the reflection of the background that I'm working in onto the piece. So when you're painting, you always want to think about how the environment of the piece is interacting with the piece and how that affects the colors. And then I'm just going to do a couple more leaves here for you guys to see. I keep calling them leaves, so they're petals. A couple more petals. And again, I'm going to start with the darkest areas and the darkest petals first. So here you can see that I'm going in just with this straight dark blue color, the straight navy color here. And this is going to be basically the darkest area of my piece. And I actually did not use any black for this piece at all. However, if you start off and you're using a blue tone and it's just a mid-tone blue and isn't dark enough, then you can just add some black into it, just a little at a time to make this navy color here. So you want to lay the darkest part first, and then I'll go ahead and start to do the areas that lighten up a bit. And as you can see here, I'm grabbing that color that I had in my brush, the darkest color, and going back to an area I'd already done and kind of just enhancing it by layering another layer of that dark color on top. And that's really important when you're painting, to constantly work the whole piece so that it looks unified and the same. And don't be afraid to go back over other areas with another layer, because the more layers that you add to it, sometimes that creates more dimension and it just makes the piece even that much more beautiful. And then here you'll see that I switch back to the thicker brush. So what I like to do is I like to lay down the main colors of the leaf all together with only a few strokes with a thicker brush. And that's what I'm doing here. So I have that mid-tone, and then there's a little bit of an area that's a bit lighter. So I'm going to go through with the same brush and add that in. And this is a really great way to do it because the colors are still wet. So at this point, they're really, really easy to blend. And a good tip for blending is to blend really light-handed. So if you push too hard on the canvas, you'll notice that the paintbrush is just going to scoop up all the paint. So you just want to be nice and light-handed with your strokes here. I'm putting very, very little pressure on the brush as I do this. And then once I have kind of the main colors down, then I'm going to go in and add some of the highlights on top. And it really depends. If you want a softer gradation from one color to another, then you can do it while it's still wet. Or if you want to wait till the piece dries, that's when you can add in some more harsher lines or harsher shadows or harsher highlights, depending on what you're working on. And then here I'm just going in and I added in a little bit of shadows that are in the piece. And you could wait till the piece is dry to do this, or if you wanted them to be blended more, you just go in and do it while it's still wet. And then here you can see, I just noticed that as I'm painting, I made a mistake drawing on the reference image. So one of the petals didn't transfer properly and I didn't draw it on properly. So this happens all the time, especially when you're transferring an image. Sometimes you'll realize that you forgot to transfer a line or something doesn't look the same as a reference photo because you missed some darker areas. So you just go through and fix it. Never be afraid to go back and alter things a second time or rework them. That's just always part of the process. And then I'm going to continue to work on these darker areas here to start. So this was a really great way to kind of attack this piece, because every time that I worked around this peony, there was different areas that had different ranges and values. So some areas were really dark and then others were really light. So working from dark to light was really, really helpful, because I always had the darkest pieces done, so I could always reference those, especially when you get to those mid-tone pieces where you're trying to decide how dark to make it or how light to make it. You can really reference the darker areas and say, okay, well, this area is this dark, so I need to make this area a little bit lighter. And if you ever lay down paint to an area and you realize that you didn't make it dark enough or you didn't make it light enough, that's kind of the beauty of acrylic paint. You can just paint over it. So you don't have to worry about getting things right or perfect, because you can always fix them. And another really good thing about this project here is it gives you a lot of opportunity to practice doing the same type of techniques over and over, because it's quite detailed. And so you just want to take your time with this, and the objective shouldn't be to get it to look perfect or to get it look exactly like mine. More so, you just want to learn about the different techniques and how they feel when you paint them, and how much paint to put on the brush and how little paint to put on the brush. These are all things that you learn when you go through a class like this. So it's a really, really good exercise. And that's one of the reasons why I love painting peonies. It's kind of repetitive, but in the most beautiful way. There's so many different values and tones, and really identifying them is part of the fun. Deciding, which part is really, really dark and which part's light, and then translating that with the paint. So when you're painting each petal, there's two things that you want to be thinking about. The first thing is the values. So what area is darker, what area is brighter, what area is the midtones, these types of things. You want to establish that right away when you're looking at the piece. But the second thing you want to think about is working from back to front of the piece. So for example, for this petal that I'm working on right now, there's clearly an area that's behind another area. So there's a petal behind a petal. And that's really what you want to think about too. So you want to start off with the areas that are to the back first and then work your way forward. So for this entire piece, you'll notice that when we're working, we're going to start with the back and work our way up. Just like we started painting the background first, and now I'm painting the darkest colors. The darkest areas are normally the areas that are set furthest back or inset a bit. So when you work that way, it's best, because if you're trying to put an image in front of another image, it's easier just to paint it on top versus trying to paint an image behind another image and you have to paint around the main part. And it's just really frustrating and a lot harder to do. So whenever you're working on this piece, you want to think, okay, every section you move around, you want to think, which area is to the back? Which is the furthest away from the viewer? And that's the area that you want to start with. Because you can always paint something on top, you can always paint something in front, but to paint something around that is behind is very, very difficult. And you want to always attack a piece using strategy, because that's just the best way. So I'm going to go through back to this piece that I'm painting now, and now I'm going to paint the petal in front. And you can see that it's just so much easier now that I have the background to paint it in front. And you can also have the edges meet so much more seamlessly because you can overlap the front layer, the front petal so much easier and seamlessly by going over the back one even just a little bit, so that there's no kind of red peeking through where they touch. And if you wanted to leave a little red peeking through where they touch, that's okay too, because I think that's one of the most beautiful things about painting this red background first, is having it peek through in little areas. And as you can see here now, I'm just going over with that pink again, just to kind of pick up some of the lightest areas of the piece where light would be reflected from the background. So at the end of the entire piece, I'll go through with white and do a similar thing, similar technique. But for now, I'm going to go through with this kind of pink tone to pick up some of the background. And as I'm doing this, I'm using a dry brush technique. So I'm only going through areas that are, for the most part, completely dry, and just going really, really lightly over them. Okay, next I'm gonna move forward to working on some of this mid-tone area. So I'm gonna work on the area that's to the left and the top of the flower here. And so the petals that I completed were all kind of the darker petals that were on the exterior of the piece. You wanna go ahead and finish that first. But next we're gonna talk about this area. So when you start to move over to that area, there's so much going on, there's so much detail and so many petals overlapping other petals in this area, might be hard to kind of know where to start. So what I like to do is I like to fill in what I like to call the negative space between the petals that are all overlapping each other. And this really goes back to the same technique of working the darker areas first and working the areas that are the furthest back or the most recessed. So that's what I'm doing here. And it's easier, I find, when you're doing this type of technique to look at the negative space between the petals as opposed to painting the petals themselves. So looking at the shape of the negative space will help you paint it and fill it in more accurately than necessarily looking at the petals around it and trying to do it that way. So I like to do that. And then also here, you'll already start to be looking around and referencing the colors around to know how dark or how light to make these areas here. Now these areas are still pretty dark, but as you can see in the photo reference, they're not quite as dark as the pure navy itself. So I'm going to be working more in those mid-tone blues. And then of course, once that area has dried, you can go in, as I'm doing here, with the light blue and do the petals on top. For this whole area, I'm just going to use this smaller brush here because there's so much small detail. But yeah, you start off with the darker areas and then fill in those lighter areas on top. And also, it doesn't have to be perfect, and that's another reason why I chose this piece. It may seem like it's pretty complicated, especially if you're just new to painting, but it's broken off into little sections that you can just focus on one little section at a time, and it'll really help you to mix the proper values, you know, the proper light to dark ratios on each petal, and to learn about that. And also, if you make a mistake, you just keep going. You can either fix it by painting over top of it or just keep on going. It doesn't have to be perfect. And that's something that you really want to keep in mind. You know, when you're painting petals, petals don't have a definitive shape. Like, for example, a heart has a very definitive shape. And if your heart's all squished or off to the side, people will know that it's not proper, so to speak. But when you're painting a flower, flowers vary so much. They have so many different, you know, forms and shape, and it's not all so cut and dry. So it's a really great piece to start off painting because it doesn't have to be perfect. So you can just kind of go and enjoy and not be so hard on yourself trying to make it look exactly like my painting are exactly like the reference photo. I just can't stress that enough because it is really stressful or difficult. It can be when you're starting to paint for the first time and you really want to make something look exactly right. And, you know, it's just about enjoying the process and getting better each day. So there's a little positivity for you for today. All right. I'm going to do a little bit more of this area beside now, and I'm just going to use the same technique. So what I'm going to do is paint the areas in between and then go back through and paint the ones on top. And then I've just sped this up a bit because I still wanted you to get the idea of what I'm doing without having to sit through me watching me do the exact same thing over and over and over. And sometimes as you paint, you'll notice that you missed a line in a certain area, and that's kind of the beauty of using a reference photo. You can keep referencing the photo and checking, okay, this looks kind of weird, or this is right. Oh, I missed a line here. Just keep moving back and forth between the photo. And also, when you're going from a dark color to a light color, you should always clean off your brush because the dark colors grab onto the light color so easily. So you want to keep that in mind as you're painting too. Okay, so I finished filling in the top part here. And now I'm going to move on to this kind of clustery area in the middle because I'm going to use a different painting technique for this. So I'm going to use a bit of a thicker brush here. And as I lay the colors down in this area, you can see that in the reference photo, the colors vary quite a bit. They're not so cut and dry. They're not so clear. So they have lots of mixes of different colors all in one. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab different colors on my brush all together. So I'll grab a little bit of light here and put a stroke down, and then kind of grab a little bit of the mid-tone, like you can see I'm doing here, and then put a couple stroke downs. And I'm not mixing them all the way in between. I'm just kind of letting the colors go down onto the page however they like. So I pick up a little bit of this color and a little bit of that color on my brush, and instead of mixing them together, I kind of leave them unmixed so that all the different little variants kind of fall down and create form on their own. So this is a technique that I like to use a lot, and it basically lets the brush do all the work for you. So you're just picking up a little bit of color, and then the fact that you haven't really mixed them, they kind of come off onto the canvas in their own way, and it's really, really nice. I use this technique a lot when I'm painting fur too. I'll run my brush through a couple different colors and let kind of lines of that color collect on the brush. And then when I place the brush down, it kind of lets the color down in its own little way. It's a little bit less predictable, but also creates a little bit of this kind of beautiful random color placement. It's the best way I can describe it. And then I'm just going to go through and do kind of the similar technique for the rest of the petals here. And then I'm just going to show you a couple more of these petals down here. I just am doing sped up here, but I'll show you that here I'm using a different technique where it's more like wet blending. So I'm picking up quite a bit of color on my brush every time I put it down. So for example, starting from the light area here and then working to dark. Here I'm doing it a little bit different just because it makes more sense to do it that way, to kind of catch that one little highlight there. I'll put that down first, and then I can kind of work the dark area around it. And then here I'm working pretty fast. Obviously it's sped up, but I'm actually working pretty fast too because I want to blend everything while it's still wet. So you just want to kind of keep that in mind as you're going through certain areas. If you want to make sure that you blend them, make sure that you're blending them all while they're still wet. Now, if you have an area that starts to dry too fast while you're trying to blend it, just let it dry completely. And then once it dry completely, you can go back over it with both colors again. And here too, you can also see that I'm going back over certain areas where the light hits to kind of show that. And now here I'm going to go through and add in some details with this detail brush here. So any areas that were kind of lost as I was laying down these main colors, I can go back over and add in while it's still wet. And then for this last little part of this area, I'm going to do the same technique that I did before, picking up multiple colors and just laying them down all together and just having that be kind of random how they show up. I love this technique because you never really know what you're going to get. But it makes it really nice. Okay, now this area is completely dried. I'm just going to show you that once it's dry, I'm going to go back over and redefine some of the shadow areas that are created by the petals overlapping on top of each other. So a little bit in the middle there. Now I'm doing this petal that's closer to the bottom here. You can see in the reference photo, they have some of those like harsh shadow lines. And these are easiest to do once it is completely dry in some areas, like the areas that I'm doing here. And if you paint a section and notice that it looks a little flat or needs a little bit more definition, you can let it dry completely and then go back over it and add in that definition as a second layer. Never be afraid to keep adding layers to keep creating form in a piece, because that's really what makes it really pop and lots of contrast. And then like I did before, I'm going to go through with this pink and add in a little bit of highlights so that the piece looks like it's interacting a little bit with the background and getting some of those reflections that the light would have created. Now, again, with this, I'm using that dry brush technique, which is where I only take a little bit of paint and then I kind of really work it onto the piece. And you want to make sure that the underpainting is totally dry when you do this, because otherwise you'll pick up the paint underneath and it'll be a bit of a mess. Yeah, just adding little bits of that pink all around. Okay, next I'm going to go through and work on the lightest area of the piece. So finally we've gotten to this side, the left side of the piece, and I'm just going to go through and fill in a lot of the petals with the lightest blue. And some of these petals, like these next couple petals that I'm going to paint, I'm going to fill in the blue, but then also add the mid-tone blue as I'm mixing. And again, you want to make sure that you're thinking about the direction of your strokes of your brush. So here I'm going to add in a little bit of light blue here, and then I'm going to go in and add this mid-tone as it's drying. And I'm really paying attention to creating the petal form and the way that those lines through the petal are formed and trying to emulate that with my brush strokes. And yeah, just mixing the colors together while they're still wet. That's the best opportunity that you have to make that main form. Then you can always go through after and add in highlights and lowlights and shadows and all that kind of thing. But you want to get the main form down with your first couple strokes, and you want to use a bigger brush for that. And then you can see here, I'm going through with the smaller brush and just adding little highlights here and there to the piece. Now here I'm going to go through with the deepest blue. So this is just the navy with nothing in it. And I'm going to go and add in that darkest area of the middle of the peony. And I'm not going to add any of those little bits that come up. I'm not sure what they're called, but the little bits in the middle there. I'm just going to add the darker area of the center of the flower at this point, and then I'll add all those little dots in after I complete the piece kind of near the end, and I'll pull in some colors from the piece to do that. So right now I'm just adding in that darker center area. And then next I'm going to go through, you see I've completed the bottom half here, the bottom left half of the piece. I'm just going to go through and I'm going to add highlights to these pieces. So you can always bring something up further. So unless it's pure white, you can always bring it up even lighter. And that's what I'm going to do with all these kind of more highlighted areas. I'm going to bring in the white at this point and add in an extra layer. This is just going to create so much depth in the piece. Already you can see with that one petal, it really kind of brings it up and creates more contrast. And I love anything super high contrast. It just gives it that really nice visual impact. So I'm going to go through and add this in. And again, just like I did with the pink, I'm going to go through and use that dry brush technique. So in the beginning, when I was painting the petals, I was using quite a bit of paint. But here, when I'm painting the petals, it's quite light. So I'm just taking a little bit, and you can see here, I'm wiping off my brush a bit. And I just want a small amount of paint so that I can create that kind of dry brush technique. And what it does is basically it allows the paint to be a little bit more see-through. And that kind of makes it look more realistic, as opposed to if I were to just draw on straight white, you wouldn't be able to see any of the painting underneath, and it wouldn't look real. So I really love doing this technique. And when you use this dry brush technique, it also helps to create more value ranges, because in some areas you can see through it a little bit, and in other areas it covers a little bit more. And so it creates an additional value range, which is really, really nice. And then just to complete this little area, I'm just going to go through again with my pink, just over top of the white, really lightly, again, once the white has completely dried, and use the same dry brush technique to add a little bit of pink onto the petals as well. And I'll just put a little on the back petals too, just what's left on my brush. Okay, so now I'm gonna go and move on to working the background of this piece. So for this, I'm using a bunch of different colors, and I'm mixing them into the pink to kind of mute them down a little bit so that they're not all so intense. So here I'm using a little bit of purple mixed into this pink color, and I'm also going to grab a little bit of blue to start from my other palette, and a little bit of this teal color. So if you don't have all these colors, you can mix them, or if you don't want to mix them, that's okay too. You can use your own colors in this area too. It doesn't have to be exactly like this, but basically what you want to do is mix a bunch of them together. And when I mix it, I'm not mixing it so it's all incorporated. I'm leaving little bits of each color together. And then what I'm going to do is kind of lay these strokes down onto the background. And I'm going to use quite a bit of paint here, because I want the paint to stay wet so that I can keep adding in different colors and creating a soft background. So this is going to be using that wet blending technique, where you lay down the colors all while they're still wet and blend them in together, and that's going to create a softer background. And we want a softer background because we want the main image of the peony to really stand out. And the peony has so much detail in it and has a lot of really tight lines. So making this soft background is a really nice contrast and a really nice background for it, because it really lets the peony stand out but still frames it in a beautiful way. So I'm just going to go ahead and speed this up, but the technique for it is still the same. So I'll take a little bit of color, and I want to vary the color. And also, as you can see here, I'm painting around the peony, but I'm not too worried about the lines of the background or the background colors that I'm laying down come up right beside the flower, because I want some of that beautiful red that we talked about at the beginning to kind of peek through. And this is why it doesn't really matter if it's a unified color in the background or not, because most of it's going to be covered up here. But you can see that when you leave little bits close to the edge, or you can see there's a little bit inside the peony where the red's peeking through, it just looks so nice. And it just creates so much more depth in the piece as well. So the strokes and the direction that I'm going, it's just kind of random. There's no, I'm not going in a specific area when I'm doing this, but I am kind of keeping the top area of this piece a bit more purpley blue to kind of match the mood of the piece. I am adding in a little bit of this teal. You can see some here just as a little bit of splash of color, but for the most part, it's going to stay in that pinky purple blue range. And that's because when I get to the bottom, you'll see soon that I'm going to add in a little bit of a green color to kind of make it look like the blurred background of a leaf, the leaves area. So the area at the bottom will be kind of more reminiscent of blurred leaves in the background just a bit. So it helps to add some variance. And then you can just go back and forth like I'm doing here. I'm adding a bit more color to the top in different directions. And this is a good time to just kind of play, relax, let yourself kind of do whatever. It doesn't have to be perfect. And it's just really nice, you know, especially if you put on some music and kind of get lost in your music and translate that to doing kind of a nice abstracted background. It's just a really good time to vibe out. And also make sure that you're using quite a bit of paint when you lay down the paint, because the more paint that you add at this point, the thicker it will be and the longer it will take to dry, and it'll just make it easier to blend out. Okay, so next I'm going to go in with this. This is like a olive green color. It's quite bright. You could mix this by using quite a bit of yellow and a little bit of blue and a little bit of white. It'll give you a similar color. But I'm going to kind of mute it down here. As you can see, I'll take a little bit and then I mute it down with that pink color. And it'll still give off a little bit of the green. But to start, I don't want it to be too intense. You can always make stuff more intense. You can always make your color more intense or your painting more intense. But to take intensity away is quite a bit more difficult. And now I'll go in with a little bit more, as you can see, and a little bit of the teal here. And here I'm just going to kind of keep the green to the bottom of the piece where all those beautiful leaves of the peonies would be meeting. They'd all be at the bottom. So I'm just going to, it's still abstracted, but I still give you kind of a taste of where that would be. And as you can see also, I forgot to mention that I'm just painting over the drawing of where the stem is. And I'm going to go ahead and put that back in a second here. It's just easier to do it on top. And sometimes that happens. So yeah, you just kind of want to go with the flow with your piece. If you decide that you've drawn something down, but you decide that it would be better if you just covered it and did the detail on top, then just go ahead and go with that. Okay, so next here, I'm going to go ahead and create those little bits that were inside the flower here that I said I'd come back to later. And I'm just going to mix a little bit of the navy in with the purple here and just start to make little dots inside. You can do this kind of randomly, it doesn't have to be perfect, but I'm also going to be twisting my brush, as you can see, to kind of vary all the little bits so that they're not all the same shape. And then I'm also going to go through and add a little bit of a highlight on them once I'm done. So I'll lay down the main ones and then I'll go in and add a bit of a highlight. So I'm going to take a little bit of this color here, this kind of purpley color, and just go through on top of them. Just really lightly. I have barely any paint on my brush, and I'm just kind of touching each one really, really lightly, and that'll just give a little bit of dimension. Okay, so now I'm going to take my same drawing from the beginning, and I'm going to lay it down here and just reestablish those leaves at the bottom of the peony. Obviously, you want to wait till your piece is completely dry here before you do this, but you can just go back in with a piece of carbon paper underneath your transfer paper here and just go in and redraw that area. Now, it would be smart to use a different color so you knew where you were going, but I just decided to use the same orange since it's just only a couple leaves that I'm drawing on here. And we'll get that last one in there. And all you need is the outline. And as you can see here, that's all I got. Okay, so now we're going to do the leaves and we're almost done here. So I like to keep all the colors that I mix in the painting from the same family. So I'm taking some of that green that I laid in the background and mixing it with the navy blue, and then that will give me kind of a mid-tone green to start off with. And I'm also going to be doing the same technique where I kind of let the colors mix together for me. So I'll lay down the main stem here in kind of one solid color. But then for the petals, I'm going to pick up a little bit more of that green color and not kind of dry my brush or change my brush. And you'll see that it kind of gives different varied effects of the color transferring. And also, as you're doing this, you can roll your brush a bit in your hand and it'll give different areas of the brush, will give different bits of color coming down. So if your brush starts to go a little dry, just kind of twirl it a little bit in your hand, just like I did there. And you'll see that now I get a different kind of view of the color. And for the little tip of the leaf here, I'm going to come back from the other side, and that'll make it easier to get more of a defined edge there. And I'm just going to go and do my last little one here by picking up some of the blue, adding that in, twirling my brush, especially as I get onto the finer areas here. Now I'm just going to add a little bit of highlights. So a little bit more green down the stem here, a lighter color, just to make a bit of a highlight. And then I'm also going to grab a little bit of the pink, just like we did for the petals. And I'm going to add a little bit of pink onto each of the leaves and the stem just to create a nice little highlight. Bring it up even further than the first highlight that we landed. So lastly, I always encourage everybody to sign their piece and date it. Even if it's just a practice piece, it's always nice to save it and come back to it at a later date and see how far you've come. And then you can go ahead and take off your tape and see those nice, beautiful, crispy edges that are so satisfying at the end here. And that's it. I really hope that this piece helped you guys and that you learned a lot through it. I know there were a lot of challenging areas, and so I'm so proud of you for sticking with it. And I'm so happy that I could be here to teach you. I hope you guys had an awesome rest of your day, and we'll see you soon. All right, well, that's it for today's class. I really hope you guys learned a lot. I hope that you enjoyed it and weren't too hard on yourself, because I know it can be a bit of a stretch for someone who's just starting out, but I think it's really good to push yourselves in these types of classes, because it doesn't matter how good it looks at the end. It's really just about learning new techniques and taking those with you into your practice as you move forward. Thanks again. And if you want to tag me on Instagram, I'm at Corey J. I always love to see your process. And otherwise, we'll see you next time. Bye.